Margaret's hands trembled as she held the phone against her ear, her daughter's voice sharp and impatient on the other end. "Mom, we've talked about this. Dad says you're being dramatic again. And honestly, I don't know how much longer I can keep defending you." The words landed like stones in still water, each ripple spreading wider than the last. Margaret steadied herself against the kitchen counter, the morning light filtering through lace curtains that had hung in this window for 23 years. The same window where she'd waved goodbye to her children on their first days of school. Same kitchen where she'd cooked thousands of meals no one remembered. "I just thought, maybe you could come by this weekend," Margaret said softly. "The doctor wants to discuss my test results, and I'd like someone there with me." Silence stretched between them like an invisible wall. "I'll try." "Mom, but you know how busy things are." The line went dead before Margaret could respond. She set the phone down carefully, as if it might shatter, and turned toward the coffee pot. Her reflection caught in the kitchen window, 59 years old, hair more grey than brown now, lines around her. Eyes that hadn't been there 5 years ago. Her blouse felt tighter than usual, pressing against her skin in a way that made her suddenly self-conscious, even alone. When had she started looking so tired? When had everyone stopped seeing her? The room tilted suddenly. Margaret gripped the counter, waiting for the dizziness to pass. These episodes had been happening more frequently, moments where the floor seemed to shift beneath her feet, where her vision blurred and her heart raced without reason. But it was more than that. Some mornings, her body felt unfamiliar, swollen in places that hadn't been swollen before, as if it no longer obeyed quiet rules, as if she were taking up too much space in her own skin. Her husband, Richard, had dismissed it as woman's trouble when she'd mentioned it weeks ago. "You're just getting older, Margaret. Everyone feels tired at your age, but this wasn't tired. This was something else, something the doctors hadn't named yet." A car door slammed outside. Richard was home early from his morning meeting at the church council. Margaret quickly composed herself, straightening her cardigan and smoothing her hair. She'd learned to appear fine, even when she wasn't. It was easier that way. Richard walked through the door without greeting her, his presence filling the small kitchen with a familiar coldness. He'd been this way for years now, distant, dismissive, as if she were furniture he'd grown tired of noticing. "I'm going to need dinner at 5 tonight instead of 6, he announced, opening the refrigerator without looking at her. "The Hendersons are coming over to discuss the fundraiser." "Of course," Margaret replied automatically. "I'll have everything ready." "And Margaret." He turned to face her, his expression calm, almost kind. "Please try to pull yourself together. People notice these things and they don't forget." The shame burned through her chest. She'd had another episode at the grocery store, a sudden wave of disorientation that left her standing in the cereal aisle, unable to remember what she'd come for. Mrs. Henderson had found her there, gently guiding her to a bench by the pharmacy. The kindness in the woman's eyes had been worse than judgment. "I'm sorry," Margaret whispered. Richard sighed, the sound heavy with manufactured patience. "We need to discuss something important tonight, after the Hendersons leave." He walked away before she could ask what he meant, leaving her alone in the kitchen with those words hanging in the air like a threat she couldn't quite name. Margaret stood there for a long moment, her hands still gripping the counter. Something was changing. She could feel it in the way Richard looked at her now, or rather didn't look at her, in the way her children's calls had become shorter and less frequent, in the way her own body seemed to be betraying her, one dizzy spell at a time, one unexpected swelling at a time. Through the window, she watched a bird land on the fence post in the backyard. It stayed for just a moment before flying away, free and unburdened. Margaret wondered what that felt like. Tonight, she would learn what Richard needed to discuss. Tonight, something would shift in her carefully maintained world. She could sense it the way animals sense storms coming, an instinct born from years of reading silences and measuring distances between words. But what she couldn't know, what no one in that house or this town could possibly know, was that Margaret Holloway carried something with her. Not money exactly, not yet, but a signature, Document. A kindness she'd once offered when no one else would. Something small and forgotten that would prove to be anything but small. If you've ever felt overlooked, dismissed, or quietly set aside, stay with Margaret. Her story is only beginning. The Hendersons left at 7:30. They're polite. Smiles fading the moment they stepped through the door. Margaret had seen it. That quick exchange of glances between Betty Henderson and her husband. The kind of look that said more than words ever could. She'd dropped a serving spoon during dinner. Just once, but it had clattered against the china plate with a sound that seemed to echo forever in the sudden silence. "Margaret's been under the weather," Richard had explained smoothly, his hand briefly touching hers in what might have looked like comfort to anyone watching. But Margaret felt the pressure of his fingers, a warning, not a gesture of care. Now they were alone. Richard cleared the dishes without speaking, his movements deliberate and unhurried. Margaret stood by the sink, her heart beating too fast, her hands damp with something that wasn't dishwater. "Sit down," he finally said. She sat at the kitchen table, the same table where they'd shared 26 years of meals, where they'd helped their children with homework, where they'd once been something that resembled a family. Richard remained standing. "I've been patient, Margaret. More patient than most men would be." The words were calm, reasonable. That's what made them frightening. "I don't understand," she whispered. "Your episodes, your confusion, the way you embarrassed us tonight, and last week at the market, and the week before at church." He paused, letting each example land. "People are talking. They're asking me questions I can't answer." Margaret's throat tightened. "The doctors are running more tests. They think it might be. It doesn't matter what they think." Richard's voice cut through hers like a blade through silk. "What matters is that I can't continue living like this. We can't." The room seemed to shrink around her. "What are you saying?" He pulled an envelope from his jacket pocket, crisp, white, official-looking, the kind of envelope that changes lives. "I'm saying I've consulted with an attorney." Time stopped. Margaret stared at the envelope, unable to move, unable to process what she was hearing. Divorce. He was talking about divorce. After 26 years, after everything she'd given, after becoming invisible in her own home, her own body, her own life. "Richard, please, this isn't a discussion, Margaret. It's a decision I've already made." He placed the envelope on the table between them. "You'll want to review these papers, though I should tell you my attorney assures me this will be straightforward. Given your condition and your inability to contribute financially to the household for the past several years." "I raised our children," Margaret heard herself say. "I took care of this house. You did what any wife would do. That doesn't entitle you to half of what I've built." The cruelty of it took her breath away, not because it was loud or violent, but because it was delivered so calmly, as if he were discussing a business transaction, as if she were a problem to be solved, not a person he'd once promised to love. Margaret's hands shook as she reached for the envelope, her vision blurred, another episode starting, the room tilting sideways. "Not now," she thought desperately. "Please, not now." But her body didn't listen. It never did anymore. She gripped the table edge, fighting the wave of dizziness that threatened to pull her under. Through the haze, she heard Richard sigh, that same heavy, disappointed sigh he'd perfected over the years. "You see? This is exactly what I mean. You can't even have a simple conversation without falling apart." The words should have hurt. Maybe they did. But Margaret was too busy trying to breathe, trying to stay upright, trying to keep the kitchen from spinning. When her vision finally cleared, Richard was gone. The envelope remained on the table. And somewhere in the house, she heard him on the phone, his voice low and careful. Yes, it went as expected. She didn't put up any resistance. Margaret sat alone in the kitchen as night deepened around her. The same kitchen where she'd raised children who no longer called, where she'd prepared meals for a man who now wanted her erased, where she'd slowly disappeared, one dismissed symptom at a time until even she had stopped recognizing herself. The envelope stared back at her, waiting. But something else was there too. A memory, faint and distant, like a photograph left too long in sunlight. Years ago. How many now? 8, 10, She'd helped. Someone. An aunt. Her father's sister. A woman everyone else had forgotten, living alone in a rural town 3 counties away. Margaret had driven there on weekends when she could, bringing groceries, sitting with her, listening to stories no one else cared to hear. When the aunt died, there had papers, documents Margaret had signed because there was no one else. She'd been so overwhelmed with her own family, her own exhaustion, that she'd simply filed them away and forgotten. What were those papers? The question surfaced now, like something lost at sea, bobbing to the surface after years. Underwater. Margaret stood slowly, her legs still unsteady. She walked to the small desk in the corner where she kept household documents, bills, receipts, forgotten things. Her hands moved through folders she hadn't opened in years. And there, at the very bottom, yellowed and creased, was a folder, marked Aunt Dorothy Estate. Margaret opened it. What Margaret finds in that folder will change everything. But first, she'll have to survive what comes next. Margaret's fingers trembled as she opened the folder. Inside were documents she barely remembered signing: her aunt's will, property, deeds, and something else. A letter from a law firm dated 9 years ago marked Time-Sensitive Mineral Rights Assessment. She'd never opened it. The envelope was still sealed, the paper yellowed with age and neglect. Margaret stared at it, her heart pounding in a way that had nothing to do with her condition. Why hadn't she opened this? Had she even received it? So many things had slipped through her awareness back then. Richard handling the mail, her children needing her attention, her own exhaustion swallowing entire days. She reached for the envelope, just as footsteps sounded on the stairs. Richard. Margaret quickly closed the folder and slid it back into the desk drawer. Her hands moved on instinct, hiding something she didn't yet understand the value of. When she turned, Richard stood in the doorway, watching her with an expression she couldn't read. "What are you doing?" "Just organizing some old papers." He studied her for a long moment. "Did you read the divorce documents?" "Not yet." "You should. My attorney needs your signature by Monday." He paused, then added almost gently, "I'm not trying to be cruel, Margaret. This is what's best for both of us. You'll receive a small settlement, enough to find a modest apartment, start fresh, at 59, with a body that betrayed her daily and a family that had already moved on." "I'd like to consult my own attorney first," Margaret heard herself say. Richard's expression hardened. "That would be unwise. Legal fees would consume whatever settlement you'd receive. Besides," he stepped closer, his voice dropping, "who would believe you're capable of handling your own affairs? After everything. After the episodes, the confusion, the way you can't even make it through a simple dinner party?" The words hit like physical blows. "That's not fair. I'm sick. The doctors are still trying to—" "The doctors have been trying for 8 months. Maybe the problem isn't medical, Margaret. Maybe it's just age. Just you." He left her standing there, alone again, with words that would echo through. Sleepless nights. Margaret waited until she heard his bedroom door close upstairs. Then she pulled out the folder again, her hands shaking with something that felt like anger for the first time in years. She opened the letter. It was from a legal firm in the rural county where Aunt Dorothy had lived. The language was formal, full of legal terms Margaret didn't fully understand, but certain words jumped out at her. Mineral rights, natural resource leasing, property assessment, and potential value. At the bottom of the letter was a phone number and a name. James Whitmore, estate. Attorney. Margaret's mind raced. Could this mean something? Was there value in those dusty acres no one had thought about? Or was this just another disappointment? Another closed door? She thought of Richard upstairs, confident in her defeat. She thought of her children who'd stopped defending her. She thought of her own reflection in the kitchen window. A woman who'd been slowly erased, told she was dramatic, told she was nothing. The clock on the wall read 9:15. Too late to call anyone tonight. But tomorrow was Saturday. Margaret carefully placed the letter back in the folder and hid it at the bottom of the desk drawer, beneath insurance papers and old tax returns. Something told her to keep this quiet, not because she knew what it meant, but because Richard had trained her well. When you have nothing, you protect even the smallest possibility. That night, Margaret lay awake in the guest room where she'd been sleeping for the past 6 months. Her body ached in unfamiliar ways. The swelling in her hands and feet had worsened. She'd need to call the doctor again Monday, though she knew Richard would dismiss it as more dramatics. Through the wall, she heard him on the phone, his voice too low to make out words, but the tone was celebratory, victorious. He thought he'd won. Margaret closed her eyes and tried to remember Aunt Dorothy's face. The old woman had been sharp right until the end, despite what everyone said. She'd lived alone in that farmhouse, refusing to move, refusing to sell. "This land has been in our family for generations," she'd told Margaret once. "There's more to it than anyone knows." At the time, Margaret had thought it was just an old woman's attachment to the past. What if it wasn't? The next morning, Margaret woke before dawn. Her body felt heavy, the swelling worse than yesterday. She forced herself to stand, to dress, to move through the motions of another day. Richard had left early for his Saturday golf game, a routine he'd maintained for years, a few hours where he could pretend she didn't exist. Margaret went to the kitchen and found the business card she'd been given at the hospital, a social worker who'd pressed it into her hand after one of her episodes. "If you ever need help," the woman had said, "resources, someone to talk to." Margaret hadn't called. She'd been too ashamed. But the card also had information for a free legal clinic downtown. She picked up the phone, her fingers hovering over the numbers. One call. That's all it would take. One call to ask a simple question. What did these mineral rights mean? Was there anything there? Or was this just another false hope? Outside, a car pulled into the driveway. Margaret's heart stopped. Richard wasn't supposed to be home for hours. She quickly hid the folder again and moved to the window. But it wasn't Richard's car. It was her son, Michael. He hadn't visited in 3 months. The doorbell rang. Margaret opened it to find Michael. Standing on the porch, his expression uncomfortable, his hands shoved deep in his pockets. "Dad called me," he said without greeting. "He told me about the divorce. He said you might need help finding a place." Margaret stands at a crossroads. Her son on the doorstep, a mysterious letter. Hidden in her desk, and a phone call she hasn't made yet. What happens next will determine everything. Michael didn't hug her. He stood on the porch, hands in his pockets, eyes focused somewhere past her shoulder. "Can I come in?" Margaret stepped aside, her throat tight. "Of course. I'll make coffee. I can't stay long." Those 4 words said everything. He followed her to the kitchen, the same kitchen where she'd bandaged his scraped knees and helped him study for college exams. Now he sat at the table like a stranger, checking his phone every few seconds. Margaret's hands shook as she poured the coffee. The cup rattled against the saucer when she set it in front of him. "Mom, are you—" He stopped, seeming to think better of whatever he'd been about to ask. "Dad says you've been having more episodes. I'm seeing doctors. They're running tests." "Right." Michael took a sip of coffee he clearly didn't want. "Look, I'm not here to take sides. This is between you and Dad, but he's worried about you. We all are." The lie hung between them, obvious and painful. "If he's worried, why is he divorcing me?" Michael flinched. "It's complicated, Mom. You don't understand the financial pressure he's been under, supporting you through all this." "Supporting me?" The words came out sharper than Margaret intended. "I haven't asked him for anything." "That's not what he says." Michael's voice carried an edge now, defensive. "He says you refuse to accept that some of this might be psychological, that maybe if you tried harder—" Margaret's vision blurred. Another episode starting. She gripped the counter, fighting it back through sheer will. Not in front of Michael. Not now. "I should go," he said quickly, standing. He'd seen the episode beginning and wanted no part of it. "Dad asked me to give you this." He pulled an envelope from his jacket, different from the divorce papers, thinner. Inside was a single sheet of paper, an apartment listing. 1-bedroom, assisted living facility on the edge of town. He thought you might want to start looking at options. The words were so casual, as if he were helping her plan a vacation, not dismantling her entire life. "Michael, I'm your mother." "I know." He wouldn't meet her eyes. "But you're not well, Mom, and maybe this is better for everyone." He left without finishing his coffee. Margaret stood at the window watching his car disappear down the street. The apartment listing lay on the table, mocking her. Assisted living, for people who couldn't take care of themselves, for people who were done living and just waiting. She was 59 years old. The anger that surfaced was new, sharp, unfamiliar. Margaret had spent decades swallowing anger, smoothing it away, making herself smaller to keep peace. But something had shifted. Maybe it was the divorce papers. Maybe it was Michael's careful distance. Maybe it was simply that she had nothing left to lose. She pulled out the folder again. This time she didn't hide when she heard a car. But it wasn't Richard. It was the mail carrier, dropping Saturday delivery through the slot. Bills mostly. And one official-looking envelope from the county records office. Margaret's hands trembled as she opened it. Inside was a response to an inquiry she didn't remember making. Or had she? The past few months were blurry, lost to episodes and confusion. But here was her signature at the bottom of a form dated 6 weeks ago. The letter detailed property records for Aunt Dorothy's land, current assessed value, tax status, and a note. Multiple inquiries received regarding mineral rights leasing in this territory. Contact our office for updated assessment. Multiple inquiries. That meant companies, money, possibility. Margaret's heart raced, but this time not from illness. She looked at the clock. 10:15. The legal clinic would be open. She could call, she should call. But what if it was nothing? What if she was just a foolish old woman grasping at impossible hope? The phone rang, making her jump. "Hello? Mrs. Holloway, this is Sandra Chen from County Records. I'm following up on your inquiry about the Dorothy Marsh estate. I know it's Saturday, but I wanted to catch you before... Well, there's been some unusual activity around that property designation. Do you have a few minutes to talk?" Margaret sank into a chair, the folder clutched in her hands. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I have time." "Good, because there are some things you need to know. The mineral rights associated with that property. Mrs. Holloway, when was the last time you had those assessed?" I don't know. Years. Maybe never." A pause on the other end of the line. Then, "Mrs. Holloway, I think you should contact an attorney, soon. There's been a lease negotiation proposal filed by a natural gas company last month. The numbers are significant." The room spun, but not from an episode this time. "How significant?" Another pause, longer this time. "Significant enough that you shouldn't discuss this over the phone? And Mrs. Holloway, be careful who you tell. These situations can get complicated when family is involved." Margaret now holds information that could change everything, but the county clerk's warning echoes in her mind. Be careful who you tell. "And Richard will be home in 2 hours." Margaret sat frozen, the phone still pressed to her ear after Sandra Chen had hung up. Significant. The word echoed in her mind, heavy with possibility and danger. She had 2 hours before Richard returned, 2 hours to figure out what to do with information that might mean everything or nothing, 2 hours to decide who to trust. The answer was simple: no one. Margaret pulled out the business card the social worker had given her. The free legal clinic opened at 11 on Saturdays. She dialed quickly before fear could stop her. "Community Legal Services, this is Diane. I need to speak with someone about property rights, mineral rights specifically." Margaret's voice sounded strange to her own ears, urgent, alive in a way it hadn't been in months. "Let me check our schedule. Can you come in today?" "Yes, immediately. We have an opening at 11:30. Attorney James Whitmore will see you." The woman paused. "Ma'am, are you in a safe situation right now?" The question caught Margaret off guard. Yes, why?" Legal aid receives a lot of calls about asset concealment during divorce proceedings. If that's your situation, you need to be very careful about documentation and communication. Asset concealment. Margaret had never thought of herself as someone with assets to conceal. "Thank you," she whispered. "I'll be there at 11:30. She hung up and immediately began gathering documents. Aunt Dorothy's folder, the county records letter, anything that might matter. Her hands moved quickly, efficiently, muscle memory from years of organizing household papers. Then she heard it. A car door. Richard's car. He was home 90 minutes early. Margaret's heart hammered against her ribs. She shoved the documents back into the desk drawer, but the motion was too quick, too panicked. Papers scattered across the floor. The letter from the gas company lay exposed, its letterhead visible from across the room. Footsteps on the porch. Margaret dropped to her knees, gathering papers with shaking hands. The swelling in her joints made her movements clumsy. 1. Document slipped under the desk, out of reach. The front door opened. "Margaret!" She managed to close the drawer just as Richard entered the room. She remained on the floor, pretending to pick up something she'd dropped, her body blocking his view of the desk. "What are you doing down there?" "I knocked some papers over, just cleaning up." Richard's eyes narrowed. He knew her too well, could read the tension in her shoulders, the guilty hitch in her voice. 26 years of marriage had made them experts in each other's tells. Golf was cancelled. Rain coming. He stepped closer. "You look flushed. Another episode?" "I'm fine." "You're never fine, Margaret." He crouched down beside her, and for a moment something flickered across his face. Concern. Memory of who they used to be. But it vanished as quickly as it appeared. "Have you made a decision about the divorce papers?" "I need more time." "Monday, Margaret. My attorney needs your signature Monday, or this gets complicated." His hand touched her shoulder, the grip just tight enough to hurt. "You don't want complicated. Trust me." He stood and walked toward the kitchen, leaving Margaret kneeling on the floor, her body trembling with something that wasn't illness. She waited until she heard him on the phone in the other room. Then she carefully opened the desk drawer and pulled out just the county records letter, small enough to fold and hide in her purse. The rest would have to stay. Too risky to move now, but when she reached for her purse, it wasn't on the chair where she'd left it. Richard had taken it. Margaret's breath caught. Had he already looked inside? Did he know about her appointment at the legal clinic? The business card was in there, along with the social worker's note about resources. She found him in the kitchen, her purse sitting on the counter beside him, opened. "Looking for this?" He held up the legal clinic card. "Free legal services? Really, Margaret? You think some charity lawyer is going to help you?" His laugh was soft, pitying. "This is embarrassing. For both of us. I have a right to legal representation. You have a right to waste your time, certainly." He tossed the card in the trash. "But let me save you the trip. I've already consulted with the best divorce attorney in 3 counties. Whatever free clinic you walk into, we'll take one look at your medical records, your episodes, your complete financial dependence on me, and they'll tell you exactly what my lawyer already knows. You have no case." Margaret watched the card disappear into the garbage, her last lifeline seemingly gone. "Now." Richard poured himself coffee, his back to her. "Let's discuss living arrangements. I've put a deposit on that assisted living apartment Michael showed you. You can move in next month. It's small, but appropriate for your needs." "You put a deposit down without asking me?" "Someone has to make practical decisions, Margaret. You're clearly not capable." The words should have crushed her. A month ago they would have. But something had changed. Maybe it was the letter still folded in her pocket. Maybe it was Sandra Chen's warning. Maybe it was simply that she'd been pushed so far into a corner that the only direction left was forward. "I'm going." "Out," Margaret said quietly. Richard turned, surprised. "Where?" "Just out, a walk. Some air." "In your condition?" "My condition doesn't require your permission to leave my own house." The defiance in her voice was new, foreign. Richard's expression darkened. "Don't do anything stupid, Margaret." She walked out before he could say more, the county records letter pressed against her heart, hidden in the pocket of her cardigan. The legal clinic was 6 blocks away. She could walk it in 15 minutes if her body cooperated. Behind her, through the window, she saw Richard pick up his phone. Calling someone, warning someone. She couldn't be sure, but Margaret kept walking, 1 block, then 2. Her legs ached. The swelling made each step painful. But she didn't stop. At the 3rd block, a car pulled up beside her. Margaret's heart stopped. But it wasn't Richard. It was her daughter. "Sarah? Mum, what are you doing out here?" Dad called. "He's worried about you." Margaret stands on the sidewalk, her daughter's car idling beside her, the legal clinic 3 blocks away, and Richard's warning call already made. She has minutes to decide. Trust her daughter with the truth, or walk, alone toward the only help she might find. Margaret stood frozen on the sidewalk, her daughter's car idling beside her, engine running like a heartbeat. "Get in, Mom, please. You shouldn't be walking in your condition." Sarah's voice carried the same careful concern Richard had perfected, worry wrapped around control. Margaret's hand tightened around the letter hidden in her pocket. "I'm just getting some air. Dad said you were acting strange, confused again." Sarah leaned across the passenger seat, her expression a mirror of Richard's, patient, pitying. "Come on, I'll drive you home." Home. The word had lost all meaning. "I have an appointment," Margaret heard herself say. "An appointment? Where? You didn't mention—" "I don't need to mention everything." The words came out sharper than intended. "I'm still capable of making my own decisions." Sarah's face changed. Something hardened there. A shift Margaret recognized because she'd seen it in her son's eyes earlier. They'd already chosen sides, already decided who to believe. "Mum, this is exactly what Dad's talking about. You're not thinking clearly, making appointments without telling anyone, wandering around town. What if you have another episode out here alone?" Margaret looked at her daughter, 32 years old, successful, confident. When had Sarah stopped seeing her as a person and started seeing her as a problem? "I'll be fine. At least let me drive you to wherever you're going." The offer sounded reasonable, caring. But Margaret heard the trap beneath it. If Sarah drove her, Sarah would know where she was going, what she was doing, who she was seeing. And Sarah would tell Richard. "No, thank you." Margaret turned and kept walking, her legs screaming in protest, the swelling making every step agony. Behind her, Sarah called out, her voice rising with frustration. "Mom, this is ridiculous. You're being stubborn and irrational." The words followed Margaret down the sidewalk like stones. Irrational, the same word Richard used, the same word her son had implied. Slowly, carefully. They'd built a narrative around her. The confused mother, the dramatic wife, the woman who couldn't be trusted with her own reality. Margaret reached the corner and looked back. Sarah's car hadn't moved, but she was on her phone, calling Richard, calling Michael, building the case against her. Mother one concerned conversation at a time. The legal clinic was 2 blocks away now. Margaret's vision blurred at the edges. "Not now," she prayed. "Please, not now." She leaned against a storefront window, steadying herself, fighting back the episode through sheer will. A woman exited the store, nearly colliding with her. "Oh, are you all right?" "I'm fine. Just catching my breath." The woman studied her with genuine concern, not pity, not judgment, just human kindness. "Do you need help? Can I call someone?" "No, thank you. I'm almost where I need to be." The woman hesitated, then pressed. Then something into Margaret's hand. A bottle of water. "Take this, it's a hot day." Such a small gesture. But it was the first act of uncomplicated kindness Margaret had received in so long that tears stung her eyes. "Thank you." 1 more block. Margaret's phone buzzed in her purse. Richard calling. Richard. Let it ring. It buzzed again immediately. Then again. He was panicking now, realizing she wasn't coming back quietly. Good. The legal clinic appeared ahead, a modest brick building with a sign reading Community Legal Services. Margaret climbed the 3 steps to the entrance, each one a small victory. Her hand was on the door when her phone rang again. This time it was Michael. She answered without thinking. "Mom, where are you? Sarah says you're wandering around downtown acting strange. Dad's really worried. We all are." "I'm not wandering. I'm taking care of something important." "What?" could be more important than... He stopped. She heard muffled voices in the background, Richard's voice. "Mom, just come home. We'll figure this out together." As a family. Family. The word that was supposed to mean safety, support, love. Instead, it had become a weapon they used to contain her. "I'll be home later." "Mom..." Margaret hung up. She pushed through the clinic door into a small waiting room. A young woman sat behind a desk, looking up with a professional smile. "Can I help you?" "I have an 11:30 appointment. Margaret Holloway." The woman checked her computer. "Yes, Mrs. Holloway. Attorney Whitmore will see you shortly. Please have a seat and fill out these intake forms." Margaret took the clipboard with shaking hands and sat in a worn plastic chair. The forms asked standard questions: name, address, nature of legal issue. But when she reached the section about assets and property, her pen hovered over the blank space. What did she own? What was she entitled to? She'd spent 26 years not asking those questions. The door to the back offices opened. A man in his mid-40s, wearing jeans and a button-down shirt, approached with an outstretched hand. "Mrs. Holloway, I'm James Whitmore. Come on back." Margaret stood, legs unsteady, and followed him into a small office lined with law books and filing cabinets. He gestured to a chair across from his desk. "Before we start, I need to be clear about something. This clinic provides limited services. We can offer consultation and basic document review, but if your case becomes complex, you may need to hire private counsel." He paused, studying her face. "Now, what brings you here today?" Margaret pulled the folded letter from her pocket. Her hands trembled as she smoothed it flat on his desk. "I received this from the county records office. About property and mineral rights. I'm not sure what it means, but..." She swallowed hard. "My husband filed for divorce yesterday. He says I have no assets, no rights to anything, and I need to know if that's true." James Whitmore picked up the letter. His expression changed as he read, eyebrows rising, jaw tightening. He looked up at Margaret with an intensity that hadn't been there before. "Mrs. Holloway, have you shown this to your husband?" "No." "Good." He leaned forward. "Don't. Not yet. Because what you're holding here..." He tapped the E. "Letter. This changes everything." Margaret sits across from an attorney who's just told her that her hidden letter changes everything. But outside, Richard is mobilizing the family. Her phone won't stop buzzing, and she still doesn't know what the letter actually means, or if it's enough to save. James Whitmore placed the letter carefully on his desk, his expression grave. "Mrs. Holloway, mineral rights are often overlooked in estate settlements, especially in older rural properties. Your aunt's land, do you know its exact location?" "Carter County, near the state line. She lived there. Lived for 60 years. He typed rapidly on his computer, pulling up maps and county records. "That area has been part of a natural gas survey for the past 3 years. Multiple companies have been quietly buying up mineral rights or negotiating long-term leases." He turned the screen toward her. "The property you inherited isn't large, but it sits on top of a significant shale formation." Margaret stared at the geological maps, understanding nothing except the urgency in his voice. "What does that mean?" "It means companies want access to what's beneath your land, and they're willing to pay a substantial amounts for that access." He pulled up another document. "According to this county assessment, preliminary estimates for mineral rights leasing in your specific territory range between..." Margaret's phone rang. Richard again. "Don't answer," James said quietly. "Not yet." She silenced the call, her heart racing. "How much?" James met her eyes. "Based on similar properties in the region and current market rates, we're looking at a potential value between $200,000 and $400,000, possibly more if negotiations are handled correctly." The room tilted. Margaret gripped the arms of the chair, but this time the dizziness had nothing to do with her illness. $400,000? It's not guaranteed. These are estimates based on lease proposals. But Mrs. Holloway, the fact that a gas company has already filed a negotiation proposal means they're serious. They know what's there. Margaret's mind raced. $400,000, a number so large she couldn't process it, money she'd never known existed while she'd been quietly erased from her own marriage. My husband, he doesn't know about this? Based on what you've told me, no, and that's important because he pulled out a legal pad and began writing. Your divorce filing. When exactly did your husband serve you papers? Yesterday. And this letter from the county? Arrived this morning. James nodded slowly. That timing matters legally. If he filed for divorce without knowledge of this asset, then it wasn't part of his calculation when determining settlement terms. But if he somehow did know and concealed it, he didn't know. He couldn't have. Are you certain? Think carefully. Has he asked about your aunt's property recently? Shown any interest in those old documents? Margaret thought back through the fog of recent months. Richard sorting mail, Richard organizing the desk, Richard suggesting she clear out old paperwork just last month. Her blood went cold. He reorganized my desk 3 weeks ago, said he was helping me declutter. James's expression darkened. Did anything go missing? I don't know, I was having episodes. I couldn't keep track of... Margaret stopped. Wait, there was mail from the county I never saw. He said it was just property tax notices, nothing important. Mrs. Holloway, I need you to listen carefully. If your husband has been intercepting documents related to this property, that's a serious legal issue. It could constitute fraud or asset concealment during divorce proceedings. He leaned forward. But we need proof. Do you have access to any correspondence he might have hidden? Before Margaret could answer, her phone buzzed again. This time a text from Sarah. Mom, where are you? Dad is beside himself. This behavior is exactly why we're worried about you. James glanced at the screen. They're building a narrative, making you seem unstable, incompetent. Classic tactic when there are assets at stake. He stood. Here's what we need to do immediately. First, you need to secure all documents related to your aunt's estate. The clinic door burst open. Diane's voice carried from the reception area, alarmed. Sir, you can't go back there. Richard appeared in the doorway. He looked at Margaret sitting across. From James, at the papers spread on the desk, at the county letter lying exposed. His face went through a series of expressions, surprise, anger, calculation, before settling on concerned confusion. Margaret, thank God. We've been so worried. He stepped into the office, ignoring James entirely. Sweetheart, you left without your medication. Sarah said you seemed disoriented. James stood, placing himself between Richard and Margaret. Mr. Holloway, I presume. I'm Attorney Whitmore. Your wife and I are in the middle of a confidential legal consultation. Richard's eyes never left Margaret. A consultation about what? That's confidential. She's my wife. She's not well. She doesn't understand. I'm her attorney, and she understands perfectly. James's voice was steel. Now, unless you have legal business here, I need to ask you to leave. Richard's mask slipped for just a moment. Margaret saw something in his face she'd never seen before. Fear. He knew. Somehow he knew about the mineral rights. Margaret, please. Let's go home and discuss this rationally. Richard's voice softened, taking on that reasonable tone that had controlled her for years. Whatever you think you've found, we can handle it together. As a family. Margaret looked at her husband of 26 years, at the man who'd dismissed her illness, isolated her from her children, convinced everyone she was incompetent, the man who'd filed for divorce believing she had nothing, the man who was afraid now. No, she said quietly. I don't think we can. Richard's expression hardened. He looked at James, then back at Margaret. You're making a terrible mistake. Whatever they've told you, whatever you think you've discovered, I have the best attorney in 3 counties. You have some free clinic charity case. He moved toward the door, then paused. And Margaret? Everyone knows about your episodes, your confusion, how unstable you've been. Who do you think a judge will believe? He left, but his threat hung in the air like smoke. James waited until the clinic door closed before speaking. Mrs. Holloway, we need to act fast. If he knows about the mineral rights, he'll try to claim them in the divorce. We need to establish clear documentation that you inherited this property independently, that it's your separate property under state law. He pulled out his phone. I'm calling an associate who specializes in property law. You're going to need representation beyond what this clinic can provide. Margaret's hands shook. I can't afford. Trust me. With what's at stake, attorneys will take this case on contingency. He met her eyes. But you need to understand something. Your husband just declared war, and he's not going to play fair. Margaret has discovered she may be worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, but Richard knows. The battle has begun, and Margaret must choose. Return home to a man who now sees her as an obstacle, or stand and fight with resources she's only just discovered she has. Margaret sat in James Whitmore's office, her entire body trembling. Richard knew. The look on his face had confirmed it. He'd known about the mineral rights all along. I can't go home, she whispered. James nodded. Do you have somewhere safe to stay? A friend? Family member? Who's not aligned with your husband? Margaret thought through her contacts. Her children had chosen sides. Her friends were really Richard's friends from church, from his social circles. 26 years of marriage had left her isolated in ways she was only now understanding. No, there's no one. There's no... Then we arranged temporary housing. There's a women's shelter that... I'm not going to a shelter. The words came out stronger than Margaret expected. I won't be driven from my own home. James studied her carefully. Mrs. Holloway, I admire your courage, but your husband just showed up here within 30 minutes of you arriving. That means someone is tracking you. Your daughter, probably, maybe your phone. Margaret's hand moved to her purse, where her phone lay silent now. Had Richard put something on it? Was he monitoring her calls, her location? What do I do? First, we document everything. Every conversation, every threat, every attempt to control or intimidate you. He pulled out a form. Second, we file for legal separation immediately. It freezes assets and establishes your right to independent counsel. Third, he paused. This is important. We need to get you a medical evaluation from an independent doctor, not the physicians your husband has been taking you to. Margaret's stomach clenched. Why? Because if this goes to court, his attorney will argue you're incompetent to manage your own affairs. They'll use your medical episodes as evidence. We need documentation that shows you're of sound mind, that your illness is real but doesn't affect your cognitive capacity. Sound mind. The phrase echoed. How many times had Richard made her doubt her own sanity? I'll do whatever is necessary. James smiled slightly. Good. Because this is going to get worse before it gets better. He handed her a card. This is Dr. Patricia Morgan. She specializes in rare endocrine disorders and has testified in competency cases before. I'm calling her now to get you an emergency appointment. While James made the call, Margaret's phone buzzed. A text from Michael. Mum, Dad says you're at a legal clinic making accusations. This is serious. We need to talk about getting you proper help. Proper help. Code for psychiatric evaluation, commitment, control. She didn't respond. James hung up and turned back to her. Dr. Morgan can see you Monday morning at 8. Before that, you need to go home, act normal, and gather every document related to your aunt's estate. Quietly. Can you do that? Margaret thought about returning to that house, to Richard's cold rage disguised as concern. I don't know. Mrs. Holloway, James leaned forward. I've been doing this for 15 years. I've seen women in situations far worse than yours, and I've seen them win, but only the ones who are willing to fight. Fight. Margaret had spent her whole life avoiding conflict, smoothing tensions, making peace. I'll try. Don't try. Do it. Because if you back down now, he wins. You'll sign those divorce papers, walk away with nothing, and spend the rest of your life in an assisted living facility, wondering what might have been. The words hit like cold water. Margaret stood, legs unsteady, but determined. I'll get the documents. She left the clinic. Through the back entrance James showed her, avoiding the front where Richard might be waiting. The walk home took 40 minutes. Each step was agony, her body swollen and aching. But Margaret kept moving. When she reached her street, she saw Richard's car in the driveway. He was home, waiting. Margaret took a deep breath and walked through the front door. Richard sat at the kitchen table, her aunt's folder spread out in front of him. He'd found it. Somehow he'd gotten into her desk and found everything. "We need to talk," he said calmly. Margaret said nothing. She'd learned long ago that silence was sometimes the only weapon she had. "I know what you're thinking, that this property gives you leverage, that you found some secret treasure that changes everything." Richard's voice was measured, controlled. "But Margaret, you need to understand reality. You inherited this property 10 years ago, during our marriage. Under state law, any assets acquired during marriage are marital property. That means this mineral rights situation, if it's even real, belongs to both of us." The words were a punch to her stomach. Was he right? She didn't know enough about law to argue. "I spoke to my attorney after leaving your little clinic. He confirmed what I suspected. You have no separate claim to this property. It's marital property, which means it will be divided in the divorce, 50-50 at best, assuming you can even prove its value." Richard stood, moving closer. "Or we can handle this the easy way. Sign the divorce papers as written. I'll give you a fair settlement plus $20,000 for your cooperation. You walk away clean. No court battle, no public humiliation. 20,000. A fraction of what the mineral rights might be worth." "That's theft," Margaret said quietly. Richard's expression darkened. "That's reality. Do you really think you can win against me? Against my attorneys? Against your own medical records showing you're unstable?" He picked up a paper from the table. Medical records. Her medical records. "I've already submitted these to my attorney. Episodes of confusion, disorientation, memory loss. A judge will take one look at this and appoint me as your legal guardian. Then I'll make all decisions about the property anyway." The threat was clear. Fight, and he'd have her declared incompetent. Margaret's vision blurred, but she fought back the episode. Not now, not in front of him. "You have until Monday," Richard continued. "Sign the papers, or I file a competency petition. Your choice." He walked upstairs, leaving Margaret alone in the kitchen with her aunt's documents spread across the table, like evidence of her own foolishness. She sank into a chair, her hands shaking. Was he right? Could he really take everything? Have her declared incompetent? Her phone buzzed. A text from James Whitmore. "Don't believe his threats. Marital property laws are complex. Your aunt's estate may qualify as separate property. We'll fight this. Stay strong." Margaret faces an impossible choice. Sign away her rights to avoid a competency hearing, or fight a man with better lawyers, better resources, and a documented history of her instability. Monday is 2 days away, and she's never felt more alone. Sunday morning. Arrived with rain. Margaret stood at the kitchen window watching water stream down the glass. She hadn't slept. Richard had spent Saturday on the phone with his attorney, his voice carrying through the walls, calm, methodical, building his case against her. She'd spent Saturday night going through every document in the house, photographing everything with her phone. James had texted instructions. Document everything. Every paper, every conversation, every threat. Now, with 24 hours until Monday's deadline, Margaret felt the weight of impossible choices crushing her. Her phone buzzed. Dr. Morgan's office confirming her 8 a.m. appointment. Real. This was all real. Richard appeared in the doorway, dressed for church. "You're coming with me today." It wasn't a question. Margaret turned to face him. "I'm not feeling well." "You're never feeling well, Margaret. But you'll come anyway. People need to see us together. United. Otherwise, they'll believe whatever story that clinic lawyer is spreading." The strategy was clear. Control the narrative. Show the community his devoted, confused wife. Make her look unstable if she refused. Fine. At church, Margaret sat in their usual pew, Richard's hand resting on hers, a gesture that looked supportive but felt like shackles. People approached with concerned smiles. "Margaret, how are you feeling?" Richard mentioned, "You've been having health troubles. You look tired, dear. Are you getting proper rest?" Each question felt like a test. Margaret forced smiles, gave vague answers, felt herself shrinking under their sympathetic stares. This was Richard's world. These were his friends, his allies. She'd never built her own. During the service, her vision blurred. Another episode starting. Margaret gripped the pew, fighting it back. Not here, not now, but her body wouldn't cooperate. The room tilted, sounds distorted. Richard's arm went around her shoulders, steadying her. To everyone watching, he looked like a devoted husband helping his sick wife. Only Margaret felt his fingers digging into her shoulder. A warning. "She needs air," Richard announced to their concerned neighbors. He guided her outside, his grip iron-strong despite his gentle expression. In the parking lot, away from witnesses, he leaned close. Perfect timing. Everyone in there just saw exactly what I've been telling them. "You can't even sit through a simple church service without falling apart." Margaret pulled away from him, legs unsteady. "You did this. You made me come here knowing—" "I didn't make you sick, Margaret. You did that yourself." Richard's voice was cold now. "Tomorrow morning, 8 a.m., you sign those. You sign papers, or I file the competency petition at 9. Your choice." He walked back inside, leaving her alone in the rain. Margaret stood there, water soaking through her cardigan, and felt something crack inside her. Not breaking, hardening. All these years, she'd believed Richard's version of events. Believed she was dramatic, incompetent, too much trouble, but she wasn't sick because she was weak. She was sick because she was actually sick, and Richard had weaponized her illness against her. Her phone buzzed. James Whitmore. "How are you holding up?" Margaret typed with shaking fingers. "He's filing competency petition tomorrow if I don't sign." The response came immediately. "Let him try. Dr. Morgan's evaluation will counter it. Trust the process." Trust? Margaret didn't know how to do that anymore. She drove home alone, Richard staying for the church social. At the house, she went to the desk and pulled out the folder one more time. Inside was a photograph she hadn't noticed before. Aunt Dorothy standing in front of her farmhouse, smiling, looking strong and independent even at 80. Margaret remembered something her aunt had said during one of those visits. "Men underestimate women like us. They think quiet means weak. But I've outlived 2 husbands and a depression. I'm still here." Aunt Dorothy had left her this property for a reason, not just land or money, but possibility, a way out when Margaret needed it most. The phone rang. Sarah's number. "Mom, we need to talk. Michael and I have been discussing things with Dad. We think maybe it's time to consider a care facility, just temporarily, while you get proper treatment." The words were gentle, but Margaret heard the truth beneath them. Richard had convinced her children she needed to be institutionalized. "I'm seeing a new doctor tomorrow," Margaret said carefully. "Dad's doctor has been treating you for months. Why would you—" "Because I need a second opinion. That's my right, Sarah." Silence. Then, "Mom, you're scaring us. This behavior, the paranoia about Dad hiring lawyers. I'm not paranoid, I'm protecting myself." "From what? From Dad? He loves you, he's been taking care of you." "Has he?" Margaret's voice rose despite herself. "Or has he been isolating me, dismissing my symptoms, convincing everyone I'm incompetent so no one questions him?" "Mom, you're not making sense." "I'm making perfect sense. For the first time in years, I'm seeing clearly." Margaret hung up. Her hands shook, but not from illness this time, from anger, from fear, from the terrible understanding that she was alone in this fight, except she wasn't completely alone. She had James. She had Dr. Morgan's appointment tomorrow. She had documentation. She had the truth about her aunt's property. And she had nothing left to lose. Margaret spent Sunday night preparing. She packed a bag with essentials, just in case Richard tried to lock her out. She made copies of every important document. She wrote down everything she could remember about Richard's behavior, his threats, his control. At midnight, she sat at the kitchen table and looked at the divorce papers he'd given her. One signature, and this would all be over. She'd get $20,000 and her freedom. She'd lose hundreds of thousands, but she'd be safe. Safe. The word felt hollow now. Margaret picked up a pen. Monday morning is hours away. Margaret holds a pen over divorce papers that would end everything. Sign and lose her future. Refuse and face a competency hearing. The choice that seemed impossible yesterday suddenly feels terrifyingly clear. Margaret set down the pen without signing. At 7 a.m. Monday morning, she walked out of the house with her packed bag. Richard was still sleeping, confident she'd surrender. She left the divorce papers on the kitchen table, unsigned. Dr. Morgan's office was across town in a medical building that smelled like hope instead of judgment. The doctor was younger than Margaret expected, with kind eyes that actually looked at her, not through her. "Mrs. Holloway, I've reviewed the medical records you sent over. Tell me about your symptoms. In your own words, not what anyone else has told you they mean." For the first time in months, someone listened. Margaret described the episodes, the swelling, the confusion. Dr. Morgan took notes, asked questions, never once suggested it was psychological or dramatic. "I'd like to run some tests," the doctor said finally, "but based on what you're describing, I suspect a rare endocrine disorder. It's often misdiagnosed, especially in older women. The symptoms mimic mental confusion, but they're entirely physical. Can it be treated?" "Yes, with proper medication and monitoring, and most patients see significant improvement." Dr. Morgan paused. "Mrs. Holloway, has anyone suggested your symptoms were imaginary?" "Everyone has. That's medical gaslighting, and it's more common than you'd think." The doctor handed her paperwork. "I'm writing a comprehensive evaluation for your attorney. You are completely competent. Your illness is real, treatable, and does not affect your decision-making capacity." Margaret left that office with something she hadn't felt in years: validation. At 9 a.m. she met James at the courthouse. Richard was already there with his attorney, looking confident until he saw Margaret walk in with her own legal team. "Mrs. Holloway," Richard's attorney began smoothly, "we understand you've refused to sign the settlement papers. My client is prepared to file—" "We'll see you in court," James interrupted. "Mrs. Holloway has secured independent medical evaluation proving full competency. She's also prepared to demonstrate that her inherited property constitutes separate assets under state law, acquired through direct inheritance outside marital funds." Richard's attorney's expression shifted. "We'll need to review—" "You'll have plenty of time to review during discovery, where we'll also be examining why Mr. Holloway intercepted county correspondence regarding mineral rights and whether he concealed assets during divorce proceedings." The word fraud hung unspoken in the air. Richard's face went pale. The case took 8 months. There were depositions where Margaret's children testified reluctantly, their certainty about her incompetence crumbling under cross-examination. There were medical records showing Richard had doctor shopped, avoiding specialists who might actually diagnose her. There were phone records proving he'd intercepted county calls. The judge, a woman in her 60s who'd seen too many cases like this, was not impressed. Margaret didn't get $400,000. The mineral rights negotiations were still pending, but she got the property, her separate property, and she got a divorce settlement that included half the marital assets Richard had claimed didn't exist. More importantly, she got her dignity back. Richard faded from her life after that. Not punished dramatically, just irrelevant. He married again within a year, a younger woman who'd learned her own lessons. Eventually, Margaret's children came around slowly. Sarah apologized first, crying in her mother's small apartment. Michael took longer, his pride wounded. But they came. With proper treatment, Margaret's episodes decreased. She'd never be completely well, but she was functional, independent, free. She used her settlement carefully. Medical care, a modest house, and something special. A trust fund for women over 50, dealing with medical gaslighting and divorce. Small grants, but enough to hire attorneys, enough to fight back. Now, years later, Margaret sits in her kitchen, different from the old one, smaller but hers. Morning light filters through lace curtains she chose herself. The coffee is strong, the way she likes it. A volunteer from the Women's Center is visiting, asking about her story for their newsletter. Margaret finishes spreading butter on her toast, the simple action, now pain-free thanks to proper medication. She looks up at the young woman across from her. "What kept you going?" the volunteer asks. Margaret thinks about that question, about the night she almost signed those papers, about the moment she chose to fight instead of surrender. "I learned that being underestimated can be painful," she says softly, "but it can also be a kind of shelter. While they were laughing, I was surviving, and while they were certain I'd lose, I was quietly becoming someone who couldn't be erased anymore. The volunteer smiles, but Margaret sees something else in her eyes. Recognition. Another woman who's been dismissed, another story of quiet endurance. Your story will help others, the volunteer says. Margaret nods. That's all she ever wanted. Not revenge, not vindication, just proof that being overlooked doesn't mean being powerless. That surviving long enough to be seen is its own kind of victory. She takes a sip of coffee and looks out the window at her small garden, the bird feeder she installed last spring. The life she built from nothing when everyone said she had nothing left to build with. It's not the life she imagined at 25, but it's hers, completely, entirely, undeniably hers, and that's everything. If Margaret's story moved you, remember, every woman who's been dismissed, every person who's been told they're too much trouble or not enough sense, they all deserve to be seen, to be heard, to reclaim their own narrative. Sometimes the quietest victories are the ones that matter most.